Faulty weapons, cover-ups, and atrocities that shock the conscience. We spent decades trying to make sense of the Vietnam War, with unanswered questions going back as far as the day the US got involved. And we might as well start with the one that started it all, the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident. What we know is that on August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox fired on two small North Vietnamese boats in its vicinity. It's not clear if the boats intended to attack. 2 days later, the Maddox saw signs on its radar that the crew interpreted as more boats. The ship's intelligence officer also received messages that he interpreted to mean an imminent attack. But when President Johnson was told this information, he ordered retaliatory bombings, regardless of the fact that no attack had actually happened yet.
The Johnson administration pretty much dismissed evidence indicating that an attack actually hadn't taken place.
It would later emerge that the intelligence officer was probably mistaken and that the dots seen on the radar weren't boats at all, let alone ones shooting dozens of torpedoes at them, as the sailors first believed. In 1995, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara met retired General Vo Nguyen Diep and tried to settle the question once and for all. He asked if the attack on August 4th had actually occurred, and as historians have long suspected, the general said that no, it had not. The M16 rifle was the standard issue weapon for the troops arriving in Vietnam as early as 1965, and that was a big problem since the M16s turned out to be a disaster on the battlefield. Soldiers in a foreign country found themselves saddled with a weapon that jammed, failed to eject its cartridges, and needed to be fixed in the middle of battle. While they believed the weapons were essentially self-cleaning, this was untrue, and even less self-cleaning in the humid climate of Vietnam. Morale plummeted, and parents on the home front complained to Congress about their sons' useless weapons. That's right, the Army failed so badly here that soldiers told their moms. Many signs point to the US government knowing about the issues with the weapon before even issuing them. The M16 was tested before deployment, and it failed some of those tests. The fact that it was picked anyway might be because of how closely related it was to the M14, the rifle it was replacing. The Pentagon was allegedly resistant to change, so going with something similar made sense for them. Risks be damned. It wasn't until around 1968 that the M16 got the necessary improvements to be useful in Vietnam. Peace talks to end the war, known as Operation Marigold, were spearheaded by diplomats from Poland and Italy, along with a bit of quiet involvement from the Soviet Union. The main figure was Polish diplomat Janusz Lewandowski. Poland was a communist country at the time, so it had direct links to North Vietnam. The US, on the other hand, did not have any such diplomatic relationship, and both sides refused to come to the table until the other agreed to compromise. But thanks to Lewandowski's work, the US and North Vietnamese ambassadors to Poland agreed to meet in Warsaw in 1966. Days before this historic meeting was to take place, the US resumed bombing around Hanoi. Why this happened is unclear, though it's been blamed on simple incompetence. There was also a miscommunication about where the two men were supposed to meet. As a result, the planned meeting never happened and the war continued on. By the time Richard Nixon became president in January 1969, it was clear the Vietnam War was not going well. Yet Nixon didn't move to end US involvement until well into the 1970s. Nixon was afraid that when US troops left South Vietnam, it would immediately fall to North Vietnam, which would reflect badly on his leadership. So while he did reduce the number of US troops in the country significantly, he did not talk about leaving altogether until he won re-election in 1972. That's 3 years of misery just for Nixon's benefit. Nixon would occasionally second-guess this decision for being too evil. Letting men die just so he could stay in power was hard on his conscience. Imagine that. But his Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger, who had no such qualms. Kissinger made sure Nixon stuck to the plan, making a senseless war last that much longer. If you're wondering why Kissinger won a Nobel Peace Prize but is today mostly remembered as committing war crimes, let's just say that Kissinger's reputation is as soiled as Nixon's nowadays. March 16, 1968 saw one of the lowest moments in US military history, the My Lai Massacre. Soldiers belonging to Charlie Company, 11th Brigade, Americal Division entered the My Lai village and killed 300 unarmed civilians, including women and children. Not everyone in the village was slaughtered, and there are many first-hand accounts from survivors. It was abundantly clear that there was no way to justify the slaughter as an acceptable part of war. It was just mass murder.
Said shoot everything, man, woman, children, and the whole bit, everything that could aid the VC, every living thing.
Over 18 months later, the world was shocked to learn what happened at My Lai. Despite the horror, only one soldier was convicted for his actions in the village, Lieutenant William L. Cawley, who was sentenced to life but released on appeal in 1974. Blame for the massacre was placed on seemingly everyone and everything. The soldiers said they had been given permission to kill by their commanding officers. Over the previous months, Charlie Company had lost several members to mines and booby traps, all while never succeeding in engaging the enemy. They were frustrated and had already murdered one civilian woman in anger, and Colley was said to have been bullied relentlessly by his commanding officer, building up even more stress. All of this built up to a horrific release of frustration as the division essentially lost their minds, taking that out on innocent villagers with a heartless massacre. The event that came to be known as the Green Beret Affair involved the US Army and the CIA, and both parties blamed the other for what happened. On June 20th, 1969, a Vietnamese man going by the name Thai Hoc Truyen was drugged by several Green Berets, taken out into the South China Sea in a boat, and shot in the head. His weighed down body was then dumped overboard. Truyen was supposed to be assisting the US forces, but was suspected of being a double or possibly even triple agent. 8 Green Berets were eventually arrested for Truyen's murder, but the case against them fell apart when the CIA refused to let any of their employees testify. It turned out that while Green Berets do not normally fall under the CIA's purview, they were indeed working for them in this instance. However, the CIA denied they told the men to eliminate the alleged double agent. It denied even knowing him at all. On the other hand, the Green Berets said the CIA made it very clear Truyen needed to die. The one small silver lining about the Vietnam War is that it never went nuclear level bad, though it wasn't for lack of trying on the part of some in the US military. In 1968, General William Westmoreland was in charge of the military in Vietnam. He had long planned for a major battle to take place at a location called Khe Sanh. But when the North Vietnamese finally attacked the location, US troops had to be pulled away just days later to defend against the slew of attacks now known as the Tet Offensive. Westmoreland refused to abandon his original plan for Khe Sanh. Rather than lose the strategically important location, he wanted to use tactical nuclear weapons, or at least have them on hand in case it became necessary. He worked with other generals in the Pacific Theater on a plan to move nukes from Guam into the jungles of South Vietnam, codenamed Fractured Jaw. The problem was that the generals involved hadn't bothered to ask their commander-in-chief what he thought of the plan. When Lyndon B. Johnson learned what was up on February 2, 1968, the operation was well underway and he was furious. Despite this, the generals in Asia continued planning for another 10 days before finally ending work on Fractured Jaw. Fighting traditional wars is almost impossible in the thick jungles of Vietnam. Rather than adapt to the terrain, the US military attempted to change the landscape completely by carrying out Operation Ranch Hand, dropping what were known as rainbow herbicides on the country to clear huge areas of vegetation. The most infamous of these herbicides was Agent Orange, which was successful when it came to killing plants, and also turned out to be very effective at killing people. Dow Chemical and the other companies who produce the rainbow herbicides are certainly touchy about their involvement. To this day, Dow has an official statement on their website saying they were forced to make the herbicide due to the Defense Production Act, and that it is all the military's fault for the terrible health problems that it caused. However, there is evidence these companies both knew and hid how dangerous Agent Orange was from the government. By 1965, internal documents show that Dow knew that Agent Orange's ingredient dioxin was toxic. They even organized meetings with the other companies producing it to talk about how toxic it was. Despite that, they kept this knowledge from the government and publicly claimed the herbicides would not harm humans. And it gets worse. Almost a decade earlier, Dow knew how to lessen the amount of dioxin in Agent Orange without affecting its herbicidal abilities. It simply didn't do it. The conspiracy theory that the US government knowingly abandoned POWs in Vietnam was so widespread that it was a basis for the plot of Rambo First Blood Part 2. This conspiracy wasn't created out of thin air, as there are many soldiers who went to Vietnam and remain unaccounted for. As of 2022, the Defense POW MIA accounting agency listed 1,244 Americans as still unaccounted for in Vietnam. However, almost 500 of those individuals are considered non-recoverable, meaning there is evidence pointing to the fact that they died, but it can't 100% be proven because finding their remains may not be possible. In 2023, 4 more sets of remains were recovered and identified, with the US government promising to never stop searching. It's worth noting that there are thousands, yes thousands, of first-hand accounts seeing POWs alive in Vietnam after 1973, when all captured troops were allegedly returned to US forces. General John D. Lavelle commanded the 7th Air Force in Vietnam, and in 1972 it appeared the campaigns he was leading were doing well. So it was shocking for him when he was suddenly told to return to the US, where he was hauled in front of Congress to be dressed down and demoted 2 stars before being forced to retire. He died 7 years later, but well into the 21st century, his family still had questions about what exactly happened and why he was punished. Lavelle wanted to make sure more of his pilots came back from bombing missions alive, so he asked that the rules of engagement be made a bit looser. Lavelle claimed he was told that was fine, but for various political reasons this could not be put in writing. His version of events is backed up by several tapes recorded by President Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. After a misunderstanding of one of his orders, Lavelle was accused of telling his subordinates to falsify reports to make their bombing raids look legal, even if they weren't. This would have been raids that were illegal even under the looser rules of engagement. While Nixon is also on tape expressing anger at what was happening to the general, Lavelle was thrown under the bus by his superiors. One possibility is that they were trying to keep any information about other bombing raids from reaching the public, which, considering everything else that got covered up about Vietnam over the years, it's pretty easy to believe.